in the challenges of the 21st century. And first I want to talk about the realities of being in business, the realities of the business sector. And this is a phenomenon that's been frustrating us, defeating us, a phenomenon which we didn't understand for many years, and that is the answer to the question, why is it, having enjoyed phenomenal growth during this particular period, in this period, one of the first symptoms of the arrival of the post-industrial era was firms were not able to sustain the growth they're accustomed to sustain the profitability they're accustomed to, and this gave rise to all kinds of difficulties that we'll be talking about. And we know now why the phenomenon of low growth. To know the problem was not to solve it. In fact, we know now that the industrial society today, in many, many industries, low growth is here to stay. And now getting accustomed, having grown in the expanding society, having learned how to measure growth successfully, turns out to be very, very different. It requires very different perceptions, very different attitudes when you have to start dealing with what now people call maturity. That is, in about 50% of the industries in developed countries. So that's one of the characteristics of this environment. Now another one about which a great deal has been written, Peter Drucker again pioneered here with his early description book, is actually on change, and that's the acceleration of change. Now, it would be totally false to say that we went through the first 50 years of the century and didn't have to worry about change, and all of a sudden change devolved on us. Because in point of fact, when you look at the business firm, it is a mechanism that's unstable, that encounters all kinds of voluntary and involuntary changes, and the only reason for managers are there is because we are there to manage change. And as a matter of fact, if we didn't have to manage change, the way we would do it, we'd design factories to be run by monkeys, teach them to run the factories, lock the factories, visit it periodically to be sure they have enough bananas and that they haven't broken down the production process. And yet we don't know how to staff factories by monkeys, or even with the CAD-CAM, if you're familiar with this automation technology that is available to us. So change has been there, but what is there today is acceleration of change in this post-industrial era. Now, the acceleration means that the change became very, very much more rapid. And the question that we may want to ask, what's it doing to us? And we want to answer that question. But this rapid change has several other characteristics that are also important. A great of this change is not an acceleration in a literal sense. It lands on a death phenomena we've never seen before. So let me give you an example of fairly recent history. You may remember that there was a period where the petroleum companies of the world owned the petroleum business. The Shells, the Essos, the Chevrons, British Petroleums, and others. And the world was going along pretty well until one day 11 Arabs representing their nations, and some people from South America, went to Vienna on a Friday, and on Monday announced that from that point on they are going to run the petroleum industry, and that the price of petroleum henceforth was 4 times what it was before. And it was really astonishing what a discontinuous, surpriseful change that was. And when people tried to analyze it post factum, did we know about it? Well, the curious fact is that we had the information about it, but nobody was paying any attention to. Because the unfortunate image that we had of our friends, the Arabs, is that if you leave 4 Arabs in the room for more than 3 hours, Tamer, what do? We take our daggers. That's one of the characteristics of the change that the word acceleration by itself doesn't communicate. So there are drastic changes, and there are discontinuous changes that don't relate to a prior experience. And I lived through that period. I was living around Europe someplace at the time, and I remember, and I've been friends with some of the companies, like the Shell company. I remember the degree of puzzling, people looking at themselves in the mirror, says, what the hell do we do now? So that's so much then for the second variable that into which the previous slide translates. And furthermore, these discontinuities are frequent. Now, one other thing which is of particular concern to us in the United States, but we're not the only ones, we're just the greatest example, is what we call the loss of competitiveness. And that is a situation in which no matter how hard we try to beat the Japanese at their own game, we don't succeed. And the question we'll be asking is why? Why is that the case? It's kind of a chronic loss of competitiveness by the nation that led industrial progress during the first 50 years of the century. Another characteristic, just because it's number 4 or 5 doesn't mean it's not one of the dominant characteristics, is what people call proliferation of new technologies. Now this, as we by now recognized, is a symptom of what we are going through now, and we started going through it in the 1960s, of the second industrial revolution. Now, first industrial revolution, remember, in England, coming to us from 1830s to about break of the century, and from 1960 on, we've been bombarded with technological proliferation. And that makes management life very, very difficult. As a matter of fact, we'll be talking about myths that we have perpetrated on ourselves. In the early days of technological revolution, people said, boy, what a beautiful, beneficent force in society that is. But we better not monkey with it, because if we try to control technology, it'll stop giving us new products and so on. So when I was a young manager, your research and development had to be in a little alcove someplace up, allowed to do whatever the heck they wanted, and we would sit below in the hope that something will come down from there that we can put in the market. We must not interfere with creativity, we said to ourselves. Now, another characteristic that I don't have to tell you very much because they're representatives of this body, you are a hell of a lot tougher group of people, for business people to deal with, that we were, and at Professor Dill at about the same time in my generation. We now have consumers which said that General Motors doesn't own the environment. We own the environment. Hence the demanding customers. And I don't have to tell you anything about the next force, the militant environmentalists. So this management of complexity, multidisciplinary, all those funny stuff, translates into this something very specific, that are all problems, and problems at which at the moment we're not solving very well. Now at the level of society, what kind of society are we delivering to you in our industrial activities? Well, this, for the United States, is probably the most important point that needs to be made. A publication, I think, was the Fortune magazine, citing Bureau of Labor Statistics, gave us just recently, within the last few months, this following result of the last 20 years. And that is, the poor have been growing poorer, and they lost 9% of the standard of living during the past 12 months. And the rich were getting richer, and they gained 77%. I'm sorry, 12 months, not 12 years. 77% in 12 years. Now, one thing that is exercising us enormously, and I think for a very good reason, is destruction of jobs. Jobs are disappearing. Now, some of us, interesting enough, naively said, well, all we have to do is to train people for the jobs up to the jobs that are there. So we train people with low skills up to the skilled jobs, and then we look at the Fortune magazine, Barron's, and so on, we find out that there's about as much unemployment in the high-skilled jobs as there is a low-skilled job. So the problem is not simple, sending people to school. Destruction of jobs. The next characteristic is chronic unemployment. And unemployment has been going a little bit up, a little bit down, but from 7 to 9% of our population is chronically out of work. The next are bridges that fall, roads that are potted, railroads don't run, this destruction of, not destruction, but obsolescence of infrastructure, which is becoming decrepit. The next thing I don't have to tell you, I was driving toward La Jolla today, and lo and behold, the smog from Los Angeles is a heck of a lot closer than it was 6 months ago. Deterioration of this is infrastructure. Further, I think this is probably a mistake that either I or my typist made, but of course it's her problem. And finally, this is enormously important, and we've been living with this in our political system for many years, and it became particularly visible in the last 2 weeks in Mr. Clinton's defeat in Congress. A gridlocked political system. What do we mean by gridlocked? Well, it's like Route 15 with intersection at 8, about 5 o'clock in the evening when everybody is trying to home and nobody can go through because cars are piled and we all get gridlocked in the situation. And that's the political system we've got.